Welcome. We are honored to have you listen and participate in these dialogues produced by the Cor de Brotza Foundation. To learn more about the Foundation and about how you can help us in our mission of unearthing untold stories of moral energy, visit virtuesofpeace.com. There, you can access our show archives, show resources, visit our Etsy shop, and support us with a donation. virtuesofpeace.com. Hello and welcome to Virtues of Peace. My name is Hope Elizabeth May, and I am joined by Randy Olson and also Riley Olson. They are of no relation. They just ironically happen to have the same last name. Unfortunately, one of our regulars, Michael Buzzy, is not with us today because he is in Europe. And so if you're listening to this, Michael, after we post, hello, and we hope that you're having a great time in Austria and Hungary. So this is the first show that we're doing in 2022. We've been doing a hiatus for about 7 months. And so we felt compelled to do a show to sort of relaunch after this hiatus, the Virtues of Peace podcast, not only because today, May 18th, is the original Peace Day, and that was done to mark the opening of the 1899 Hague Peace Conference. I'll talk more about that in a moment. But May 18th, a very important day for the history of the Peace Through Law movement. And it's also an important day for the Virtues of Peace podcast, because it was on this day in 2020 when Randy and I launched the Virtues of Peace podcast, which itself was a rebirth of an older podcast that I started, I think, in 2009 called Ethics Talk. Both Virtues of Peace and Ethics Talk, there are still feeds that go into iTunes, Spotify, Audible, etc. But Ethics Talk is a broader, older brand. Virtues of Peace began again this day 2 years ago. May 18th is a day that we've talked about numerous times on this show, and it's connected to a movement which today's show is very much connected to, because today's show is continuing this mini series on Bertha von Suttner's Lay Down Your Arms. And this book was published in 1889, so 10 years before the 1899 Hague Peace Conference. This is the third in a series. Lay Down Your Arms, the text of it you can download at our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com. And today we're just focused on chapter 6, just one chapter. This is installment number 3. The page numbers are 116 to 140. And just to give you a deeper context of where we are in the text, Lay Down Your Arms has 19 chapters, and it is a total of 410 pages long, at least in the English translation that we've been reading from. And so we're about 1/3 into the text. So May 18th and the Hague Peace Conference of 1899 began the process of organizing the world so that armed conflict would no longer be used as a means of dispute settlement. And we are very compelled to do this show today. We felt the urgency because, as we know, on February 24th, Russia invaded Ukraine. And so this has been going on for almost 3 months. And it is timely, and we hope to connect at least very generally some of the themes in chapter 6 with what's going on today. And of course, this book is all the more relevant today. But structures have been created. And if you listen to the first installment of this show, or this mini series, I should say, the process of building institutions and organizing the world was very much sparked by this book and by the movement of which it was a part. Again, 10-year time span between the publication of Lay Down Your Arms and the 1899 Hague Peace Conference. So that's all I'll say about May 18th. And I'll just, if you're curious, Google May 18th Peace Day or check out some of the show archives for other shows. I think we did a show. The first show was maybe Organize the World. I can't recall, but if you Google it, you can learn more about that original pre-World War I Peace Day. But so chapter 6, to begin this discussion, I'm actually going to begin with the very last sentence of chapter 6. So you will find this on page 140 of the text. And the last sentence is short, and it just says, "What a foolish world, still in leading strings, cruel, unthinking. This was the result of my historical studies." I'm just going to read it one more time. "What a foolish world, still in leading strings, cruel, unthinking. This was the result of my historical studies." So one of the themes that we'll talk about today is the theme of thinking. And for the past few months, I have been thinking about thinking by looking at Hannah Arendt's Life of the Mind. And again, this unthinking world is what she concludes with. And this is significant because Hannah Arendt, if you don't know her, she's most famous for a book that she wrote, Eichmann and Jerusalem, and for a very specific phrase which comes out of that book, which is banality of evil. In other words, evil is not some horned devil, or it's not some awful monster. It's kind of boring, the banality of evil. And her conclusion is that we can liken it not to like being possessed by a demon or one of the 7 deadly sins, but it's simple thoughtlessness. And the horrors of the Holocaust were largely perpetrated by bureaucrats and their thoughtlessness of like looking at spreadsheets, so to speak, and just sort of mindless not thinking and mindless following of orders. I think also if you know about the Chernobyl incident, we can see a similar theme. But in any case, I just want us to focus on this idea that thoughtlessness is connected to evil and wrong and really horrible wrongdoing. And so again, she concludes this chapter with, this is an unthinking world, which in Hannah Arendt's thinking or philosophy would be, it's an evil world because it's unthinking. Now I'm gonna ask Riley to clarify, because as we were making this outline, Riley made the point that I really need to use the language of thoughtlessness rather than non-thinking, because non-thinking is a Buddhist term. And so, Riley, I'm just hoping that you could elaborate on that point.
Yeah, I'd love to. So, first I'll start with just the Buddhist idea of non-thinking. I have a quote here from Dogen, who is a 13th century Japanese Buddhist monk. This comes from his fascicle called Learning Through the Body and Mind. And he says, quote, "The stage of non-thinking is beyond egocentric cognition. If you reach the state of non-thinking, you will realize the true luminous nature of mind. Non-thinking must become the eye through which you view phenomena. The activity of every Buddha is based on non-thinking." So to contrast that with not thinking or with thoughtlessness, when it comes to not thinking or thoughtlessness, I think that is a looking away from the truth. It's like something intentional almost. Not always. Here, how do I want to put this? So when it comes to like non-thinking, it's about like truly entering body and mind and experiencing the world. So you're just acting and like doing what needs to be done without overthinking it is probably like a better way to describe it. Whereas like thoughtlessness is like you're turning your mind away from something, you're not thinking about it.
Right. Thank you for that clarification.
Yes.
So so non-thinking is is a good thing in some cases. Um,
Yes.
but thoughtlessness and not thinking is this, you say, turning away. And indeed, there's a passage from chapter 6, and this is on page 117 to 118, where this deliberate turning away that you're speaking about is definitely referred to. And so I'll just read it. And it's goes like this. How can a mother allow her only child, her treasure, to embrace so dangerous a profession as the army? And then that's Martha asking that question. And Frederick answers, Frederick von Tilling, my dear, there are simple reflections which no one ever makes, Frederick answered, considerations which lie so near one that no one ever heeds them. Such a reflection is the danger of the military profession. People do not allow themselves to take that into consideration. It is thought a kind of impropriety or cowardice to allow that to weigh with one. So, end of passage. So, it's this sentence, my dear, there are simple reflections which no one ever makes. And then he goes on to say, because it's improper or cowardly to do so. And so this is like, well, this is like a sort of painful, socially inappropriate line of inquiry. And so we don't do that. And then he says, such a reflection is the danger of the military profession. So here, I read this claim as, you know, we turn away from this and we'll look at more passages which speak to this point that you're talking about, Riley. And to actually like confront it is the danger of the military profession. And so this thoughtlessness is really essential to this institution. I'll stop there, and I don't know, Randy, you haven't.
Sure,
Yeah, go ahead.
I can definitely comment on some of these things. The first piece for me is that there's a whole category of things which, to follow the line, the reflections which no one ever makes. There's a lot of things like this, and the fact that some of our cultural and social institutions are built on them is, I think it's actually something that's important. It's, I think, one of the reasons why we're so um, touchy around discussions of religion or politics. It's because conversations about those subjects are poking people in precisely the places that are basically the foundation stone for people's attitudes, people's beliefs. And so it's not polite to poke people in places where their entire sense of self rests. So that's one thing. Um, I guess I'm trying to essentially justify why such a thing would be true. Like, why would it be appropriate to not consciously bring awareness to something that seems so central to a person's life? So, choosing to be in the military, like, why would you not have a certain set of thoughts thinking about like those choices? Well, here's a set of possible answers. So I guess the next thing, I guess I want to come back to the like the actual claim associated with, trying to remember who said it. You started with it. Arendt, that's the one, who thinks about the banality of evil, I want to come back to that really quick, because I think these things are connected in a specific place. This idea that evil is something that's boring or banal, we can see some kind of parallel between this banality and like an unconsciousness or a lack of awareness to the thing. Like, it's not full of energy, it's not full of life, it's not energized. It's this underground, subterranean thing that's not clearly in our view. And I just want to push against that very briefly, just for sake of rounding something out, because it struck me at the time. Like, the military is something that's incredibly precise and mechanical, and yet there's like a tremendous amount of thought that goes into strategizing and planning and preparing and budgets and strategies and invasion plans and defense plans. And I just don't want to present half of that and not bring the other half to the table, where it's like, yeah, there's an incredible amount of thought that gets put into the preparation for barbarism. So yeah, those are the main things for that stuff for me.
Cool. Yeah, actually, I think it was like maybe a year or two. We've discussed this point, the point that you're making about the rational activity. I think that's how it came up. The rational activity that goes on in the military, right? The incredible planning, strategy, tactics, etc. And actually, depending on, okay, here we go. We're never going to get past this one's end, as I feel it now. But for that, because of that, because there's so much intellectual or rational activity going on in the planned destruction, right, of human beings, this is a violation and a subversion. And Bertha makes this point elsewhere of reason itself, that itself is an infection. The fact that, quote, rational activity is used in subservience of destruction is a great misuse of this capacity. The conversation for another day. But yeah, point well taken. And so, in discussions of what's called practical reasoning, which is planning, like goal-directed planning, which can be done by, a military unit or by an individual. You set the end and then you discover the means. So it's an end means thinking. And, one question is about the rightness of the end, right? And so if the end is wrong, then the quote, thinking is wrong in a way. So conversation for another day. So thank you for that. That's a really important insight. And I do recall having a conversation about the extent to which the rational faculty is used in armed conflict.
Could I make one quick comment?
Please.
On that? So I think the point, Randy, that you brought up actually does connect in with what we'll get to a bit later in this episode, about reasons of state. So, coming back to this quote that we just mentioned, Frederick says, there's considerations which lie so near one that no one ever heeds them. And so the way thoughtlessness comes in here, because I think what we're kind of getting to is, how is it thoughtless if there's so much thinking and precision and planning going into it? And I think it's the considerations and reflections that are so close and so simple are the ones that we're not allowed to make, or that are impolite. yes, somehow we're allowed to, make plans about infiltrating and, strategy and what have you, because when we're making those plans, we're purposefully not thinking about, everyone who's going to be actually hurt by that. So I guess that's all I'll say. We'll come back to it.
That's an interesting reading of that sentence. Thank you for that. And I'll also add that I think that, again, we're looking at the sentence that was read. It's on page 117 to 118. It's a small dialogue between Martha and Frederick. And the question is, how can a mother allow her only child, her treasure, to embrace so dangerous a profession as the army? And then it's too close to home, and you're not supposed to think about that. And so it's also like she could be asking a more descriptive question, that is, like, how is it, like, psychologically possible for a person to do this? Like, in other words, what kind of narrative is a mother using that allows her to condone and even support her dearest treasure? And that's a kind of different question, right? Like, what kind of narrative is a mother using? But anyway, let's move on to the next, and this is a longer passage, and this is on page 128 to 129, and this also gets at, Riley, the point that you made about the distinction between non-thinking and thoughtlessness, whereas thoughtlessness is a kind of like intentional turning away, like intentional refusal to examine something that's difficult. So the quote begins this way: "This fatal prospect of war, which now filled all newspapers and all conversations, robbed me of all pleasure in my life. As often as I thought of any of the things of which my happiness was made up, and especially my possession of a husband who was becoming daily dearer to me, so often was I reminded also of the uncertainty of the imminent danger which hung over all of my happiness, in view of the war which was looming in sight. And so I could not, as the saying is, feel myself comfortable. Of the accidents of sickness and death, conflagrations, inundations, in short, all of the menaces of nature and the elements, there are sufficient. But one has habituated oneself not to think about them, and one lives in a certain sense of security in spite of these dangers. But how is it that men have created for themselves other dangers, arbitrarily devised by themselves, and thus of their own will and in pure wantonness thrown into artificial eruption the volcanic soil on which the happiness of this life is founded? It is true that people have also accustomed themselves to think of war too as a natural phenomenon, and to speak of it as eluding calculation in the same category with the earthquake or drought, and therefore to think of it as little as possible. But I could no longer bring myself to this way of looking at it. The question of which Frederick had once spoken, must it then be so? I often answered with a negative in the case of war, and at this time, instead of resignation, I felt pain and vexation. Quite a long passage on page 128 to 129, but I'll just start by saying, Randy, when we were talking about earlier, you said, how is it possible for people to you made this point about the psychological question of how is it possible for people to do evil, and I interpreted that as something like, or I see an answer to this here, or do evil in the sense of thoughtlessness, right? Not thinking. And here you see this, it's this sense of security that there are these natural disasters, which are a reality. she goes, the menaces of nature and the elements, sickness and death, conflagrations. So these things are a reality, but she says one has habituated oneself not to think about them, and one lives in a certain sense of security in spite of these dangers. And so this like thoughtlessness and not looking at it, we do it for a sense of security. I mean, that's one sort of takeaway from this passage. And so, but she was doing that, but she can't do this anymore. And just I should have set up the passage, but this chapter 6, it's like 24 pages long, and again, if you look at the text, the sort of main headings of it are marriage and garrison life, outbreak of a Schleswig-Holstein war, and history of its causes. And so in this chapter, the prospect of Frederick going off to war raises itself in the midst of this like bliss in their new married life, right? And again, to remind us of the earlier chapters, Martha has already suffered the death of a husband. And so now she like went through this period of mourning and grief, and she was reading and trying to raise their son. and so now this possibility that this is going to happen again raise its head, and she can no longer look at this in the same way as nature, right? That natural disasters we cannot control. But this is something totally, war is something totally man-made. We choose to do it. And this is what's killing her, because this dread that's she's anticipating is something man-made. And it's like causing her great consternation and confusion. Why would we do this to ourselves? It's hard enough as it is with natural disasters and such. So I'll stop and see if anybody else wants to. Go ahead. Okay.
So I just want to pick that up, and in order to do it, I have to step back and zoom out for a second. I'm going to draw a comparison which will illustrate my point. So in the modern consciousness, we have certain assumptions which are packaged into like common sense that come from thinkers in the past. And the more profound the thinker was, the more baseline those assumptions seem to be. And one of my favorite examples for this is Sigmund Freud. We take words like ego and unconscious for granted because his work popularized the idea to such a degree that we now all think this way. And I think very much the same thing was happening with the thinking that's inside of the book that we're reading, where nowadays I think that the general attitude is in fact in line with the kind of thing like the passage here. This strikes to the core of like common sense for people in the world, where it's like, yeah, like war is definitely different than volcanoes. But I think it's really important to point out that that was not like that was a radical idea when this book was written. And I have to stress that, like, we're dealing with a text that's part of a seismic shift in attitudes towards the necessity of war. And it's coming around, this is shortly before the international community really is standing on firm foundations. And so, like, the reason why this is significant, independent of its psychological reality, has to do with the I guess it's like a foresight or the impact that it has on the future of thinking in humanity. I don't know how to say that more eloquently. So I have to make that point. Now, the next piece of it is, I think that this passage does a pretty good job of separating out like the hinge between like disasters and traumatic things that happen in the world versus malevolent things that happen in the world, where like for the first time it's starting to become possible to imagine a world free of war. And why? Well, we can conceive of conditions where we're not doing this to ourselves. And that's basically like this book is really bringing that kind of thing to consciousness in a major way. For as far as I know, it's a pretty early, it's a pretty early. I don't know if it's the first kind of work of its kind, but I know it's a major one. And I'm making the same point again, I guess. So I won't go in circles again.
Well, I didn't hear that, but yeah. Riley, did you want to add anything?
I mean, you guys both said, I think, very well what I thought about this passage, so I think I'll just leave that one.
Alrighty then. And so yeah, we'll read this next passage, and if you have your text, it's page 131 that we'll be reading from next. But this, going back to Randy's point about like this is new, that like this sentiment that she's expressing on pages 128 to 129, this distinction between, natural disasters and these things that we create. Yes, and I think there's a lot in this passage also, like going back to the thoughtlessness. Yeah, sorry, thoughtlessness, or not thinking as opposed to non-thinking. But yeah, the thoughtlessness, the banality of evil point. And, she says in this passage that, people, yeah, it's the sentence. It is true that people have also accustomed themselves to think of war too as a natural phenomenon. And see, that framing, right? So how we like the narrative that we give, we have to be very careful, because the narrative may be very misleading, or it's a bad analogy, right? Something like this. And so, but she can't look at it that way. And I can no longer bring myself to this way of looking at it. And there's an evolving sensibility that's, I think, an outgrowth of the pain that she experienced from the loss of her first husband, the process of getting over it, and now the newfound and more mature love, which is really like, there's an intellectual basis. They're like, Frederick is saying things that she's thought, but she's been too afraid to say. And so it's a more intellectual bond that she has, and that this is very precious to her. And the prospect of losing it, and the pain that would cause, is almost, causing a change in her judgment, that this is something that is totally, that we choose to do it, and we can choose not to do it. So more on the evolving sensibility and the sense of like refinement. This is on page 131. She writes, and this is a character of Martha speaking, "Even the possibility is terrible to me. If it were a certainty, Frederick, I should not be crying so softly and quietly on your shoulder. I should have to shriek and wail out loud. But the possibility, nay, the probability that in the year which is opening, you may be torn from my arms by a marching order, that is quite enough to transport me with anxiety and grief." So that's page 131. And it's like, not even the actual, it's like her sensibility and what I've referred to elsewhere as like her affective, like her whole emotional architecture has been so refined, if you will, from her past experiences that this mere possibility is extremely painful. And there's also, reading this as like post-traumatic stress disorder, which was not a term when Bertha is writing this, but she's traumatized. And I think like the possibility of this is reopening that chapter and indeed, not to give the game away, but Frederick is called off and she does have, a nervous breakdown, and some other bad things happen, which we'll talk about as we get into the book. But I'll stop there and see if there are any follow-ups. If not, then I can continue. But any going once? Yes, Randy.
Yes.
Oh, Riley, both of you. Randy first and then Riley. Randy, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I'll differ. I was basically going to say that, like, it's the evolution of the conscious awareness and the consciousness and that's being put on display in the story. It's not just a single space, right? There's this whole development. There's this like a holistic growth, so to speak, of the personality, and part of it is the increased capacity for grief and anxiety. Like that's part of this. It's not like the expansion of consciousness is not all roses and sunshine.
Yeah. I had something else I wanted to add to, just like, after Martha says this to Frederick, they kind of have this little back and forth. And then kind of on the next page, Frederick says, the number of beautiful days is not the question, but the degree of their beauty. Let the future bring what it pleases, my dearly loved wife. Our present is so beautiful, so very beautiful, that I could not now feel anything but a blessed delight. I think that little bit too, while on a slightly different subject, is still important, because he's kind of saying that, like, in this moment, Martha is kind of losing herself in like she's just very, very taken over by anxiety and grief. And Frederick is telling her that, like, it is useless to throw away your happiness for what you can't change. And so that kind of comes up back to, we're accustomed to, or people had been accustomed to thinking of war as a natural phenomenon, as something we can't change. And we know that's not true. But then when it comes down to the individual, like, what can Martha personally do to change it? So I don't know, I guess that kind of tension there, that back and forth, where both perspectives, like, what happened to Martha increased her capacity for grief and anxiety, but I think that too also increased her capacity for happiness. Like, I think both kind of build each other up. And I don't know, I think it's the continuation of that scene was just important for me to bring up.
Yeah, thanks for that. Cool. Yes, so this evolution of the whole personality, right? Like everything gets more intense, pleasure and pain, joy and pain. And I think that so foreshadowing a bit, planting the seed, this joy. And see, this is Frederick's first marriage, okay? And he's really happy. And he, already is saying things that Martha has been thinking about war and so forth. And I think also, we're going to see something happening to him because he's experiencing this joy. And that will come up in the later chapters. So to Frederick, so this is on page 127. So this is Martha's second husband, Frederick von Tilling, who is possibly going to be called to war with Denmark. He says on page 127, I guide myself by the rules of honor, but I by no means imply thereby that those rules, as they now exist among us, correspond to my own moral ideal. By degrees, as this ideal gains the sovereignty, the conception of honor will also experience a change. Someday, an insult one may have experienced and which is unprovoked will redound as a disgrace not on the receiver, but on the savage inflictor. And when this is the case, self-revenge in matters of honor also will fall as much out of use as in civilized society it has become practically out of the question to right oneself in other matters. Page 127. And so I can't remember, it may be in this chapter, but when they're discussing dueling, Frederick says, yes, I've done it. I have actually, killed someone to defend my honor because it's something I had to do, given the conception of honor and where we are. But he's saying, I have my own moral ideal. And eventually, this passage is saying this ideal will gain sovereignty, that this ideal that I have within me is going to manifest, in other people. And as that does, this notion of honor is going to change. And the idea of like defending your honor will be absurd, as dueling is absurd in many other cases now. So I think that's an important passage there, that sort of Frederick is claiming, okay, I have my own moral ideal, but that's not what's guiding my actions. He's really saying that here. But that moral ideal will eventually make itself manifest in the species. So I'll stop and see. Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'm of two minds on this one. On the one hand, it feels like at this stage, and obviously later in the book we can see like some things progress, but at this stage it's like he's on the fence, right, where he wants to act differently, but there isn't a clear path forward in order to do so. It's like, oh, you want to start to live out a new set of ideals? Well, there is no path forward in culture for that. And so this feels like a rationalization to me, where it's like, I don't want to be this way. I don't want to participate in this, but I don't know how to do otherwise. And so that's where I don't know, that's how it strikes me. And then there's also this optimism packaged in, which is like, yeah, maybe one day more people will see the world the way I see it, and I'll be allowed to be my true self. I don't know, that's kind of the way I'm reading it. So on the one hand, I'm seeing like this optimistic future, but there is still this willingness to comply with something that is clearly recognized as a moral wrong.
Mm-hmm. And that could be like another form of thoughtlessness. And so this gets into like deeper questions, but so your principles are not, how can we say, like seeping down into your nervous system, and you're not acting on them. And so, on some views, you could say like that's not really thinking, if the principles are not being brought to life. It's like it's half baked. It's not a full thought train. Aristotle doesn't use that phrase, Hannah Arendt does, but like the full thought train is manifest when you have action and principle being concordant. And so I think that's, yeah, another way of thinking about thoughtlessness.
Yeah, I just I mean, one of the operational definitions of the word belief or believe
Mm.
is the kind of thing that motivates action.
Mhm.
So it's like it's what like so at this point, he's outlining his ideal, but he doesn't actually believe it because
Mm.
he's
Mm.
acting
Mm.
in a different way.
Mhm.
And so it's like it's still just this abstract thing. And I think it's interesting because, no spoilers, but like during the very soon when he ends up having to go actually participate in barbarism,
Mm.
it seems like once the other stuff starts to actually be pulled down into action, it's like, okay, now I'm seeing myself act out the thing that I don't believe in.
Mhm.
And there's what is the term in psychology? Cognitive dissonance.
Mm.
It's like he's engaged in that, and so like that's coming up. But I'm getting
Cool.
ahead of where we are.
No, and I'm just going to restate, in line with that um, his marriage and his bond, um, and we should also say that Martha's pregnant, okay, and like the prospect of having, a child, I think that is like a new factor in his psyche. That when he was going to war hitherto, he wasn't carrying that around, and now he's carrying it around, and it's like it's a different thing. And so I'm going to, yeah, heretofore, argue that as we go into the text, that's that's playing a big role in this elevated joy and so forth. Riley, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I hadn't quite thought of that passage the same way you had, Randy, and I just wanted to say, like, I guess thank you for that, because I kind of didn't recognize how much cognitive dissonance he had going on there. Um, because you're right, he's not necessarily acting on the principles that, I mean, he's not acting on, not even just necessarily, he's not acting on the principles that he holds. But I did just want to say too, like, the way I can look at this is, he wants to follow the laws basically of society, which are kind of the rules of culture or whatever, until they're changed and like change them through different means. Um, so I guess where I see it, like, because he basically is saying that, like, if someone were in the conversation about a duel, um, which actually is right before this passage, he says that if someone challenged him to a duel, he would accept. Um, and they don't talk about this, but I think he kind of implies that, like, he wouldn't challenge someone else to a duel.
Mm.
Um, so there's that there, I guess, just to add into it. So there's kind of like that slow change. And I did also want to say that, like, we don't get into duels anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Like, a lot of people still like get into fights, and like we see murders, we see assault and what have you, but like if someone insults you, like, you're not gonna like throw down your glove and like pull out a gun or a sword or something. Like, no, you're just gonna say like F you or whatever, or not respond. Like, so he is right, it has changed, it is changing.
Yes, and that fact, like that was the case, and the 19th century peace through law movement would point to that. They would point to that and say, it's like this barbarism on the level of the nation state, and it needs to grow up. As we've eliminated dueling, therefore we can eliminate war. So at the time that this is going on, in this book, that's not brought up, but Bertha's writing this. I think this is mentioned in the very first installment, and it goes back to Randy's point about this, the larger passage that I read about, we don't look at some people look at war as a natural disaster, but Martha I'm not doing that. And this is something that we're choosing. And Randy made the point that this is like such a new sentiment. And it was new to Bertha in her life. I mean, she learned about the organized peace movement, in her 40s. And then she writes this book. She had to write this book because and in the chapter, I love it, in her memoirs, when she talks about learning about the peace movement, she's like, there is a peace movement. That's the name of the chapter. Like, this thing actually exists. And she says the fact of this electrified me. And so at 40, she wasn't really aware of this, right? So this is the other piece, that the transmission of it and so forth. It's extremely important. Randy, did you want to say something, or?
Yeah. So there's one other dimension to this that I want to explore. This passage where Frederick is kind of pointing out the fact that he would like the world to be different, but at the moment he's acting a certain way. So without going into too much depth, one of the things that I want to connect here is how, Socrates chooses to not, leave the prison, right? This is a big leap, but it's like there's this respect for the state, there's a respect for the law, which goes back really long time, and we can see that there's an honorable component to respecting tradition and the way things were to get you to where you are today. I'm taking that to Plato. Maybe we could find sources that are older than that, and this idea that one of the noble characters in the story is willing to honor tradition has a non-trivial component here, because it's like maybe there was at some point an important function for dueling. Maybe there was an important function for these barbaric actions of organized groups of human beings. Maybe there was a point when the custom of war was appropriate, and it's just like we happen to be the stories set at a time which happens to be this pivotal moment when the other side begins to be possible, basically for the first time ever. And so the fact that he, as an individual, is struggling with that in his own psychology is reflecting the fact that the entire world is struggling with that at that time on the world stage. Because, I don't know, I mean, there's something to these customs. They don't just come out of nowhere. Like anything that's superfluous disappears into history and it doesn't get remembered. But something about honor and duels and conflict that includes something violent, there is something there that we can at least see the function of it. And so the fact that it's no longer appropriate is fine for us in the modern world to recognize, but it wasn't so obviously unimportant when this was being written. And the fact that it was kind of weird and needed to come to an end because we needed to grow up, like this was not a common attitude at the time. So
Yes.
Anyway,
and
giving
actually,
the devil his due.
No, I love it because it fits. It's a really perfect segue into this passage from page 133. And, you said there must have been a reason for this duel. It is in reality nothing but love. So, I mean, I'll explain, but okay, I'm reading page 133. And it begins thusly: it is in reality nothing but love. And this has such a mighty working that a man regards the work of hatred ordained in its name, even the most horrible work of the deadliest hatred, war, as the fulfillment of the duty of his love. But this glow only lasted in my heart for one instant. For a love stronger than that, for any earthly fatherland or father of the country filled its depth, the love of my husband. His life was to me, in all cases, the dearest of my possessions. So I love this passage because, see, she for a moment entertains. Oh, the reason why people are engaging in war is love. It's love of country, and this is I'm like filling my duty of love. But that is a fleeting thought, and it doesn't even hold a candle to the love that she has for her husband, which outweighs the sentiment for love of country. And, elsewhere in Bertha's other writings, she has this view of the self, which is like we're all the same person. Right. The Buddha is you. She actually says that in one of her untranslated into English texts. And so this whole dueling thing, I can see her saying something like, it's we're doing this out of love of self, but the conception of self is wrong, right? It's too narrow. And so here, right, it's done out of love, but perhaps our conception of love is too narrow, or, another reading, or maybe they're both consistent with each other. One love can trump another. So you can have like a greater love for your family than for this abstract thing called country. And so that's what's going on in her now, right? That this other love just trumps the whole love of country thing. Riley, go ahead.
Yeah, I just, connecting to what you said, like, we're all the same self. It's kind of where birth is coming from. And for Martha here, she says, the love of her husband trumps all of those. And I know earlier in this chapter and later in the book, kind of all over the book, she expresses this thought of like, it's not just my love of my husband, it's every single person in this country and every single person in the other country who has people fighting this war. All of those people have, like, say, themselves or their husband or their brother or their son or their father is going to fight, and like they all have that depth of love for the person who's going to fight. And like her whole thing in this book is just kind of this outrage, I guess, that just, why can't we all see that that love is more important and like trumps the love of country? Because it's not just Martha individually feeling that her love for her husband is stronger than her love for her country. It's like, think about all of these people because they're all the same as me,
Yeah, good point. I will go on to the final, as we've been going for about an hour. Unless Randy, do you want to follow up on any of these? Go ahead.
Sure. I mean, this isn't directly from the text, but I think it's useful to point out infinite things can still be compared with each other in terms of scale. So, in mathematics, like the concept of infinity, yeah, we can understand that, like, that has a value. We put a symbol on it to designate it. But there are different scales of infinities. And like this is something that is necessary in order for certain high-level theoretical physics and certain high-level mathematics to actually even happen. But in terms of human emotion, it's like there's an infinite range of possible pleasures. There's an infinite range of love. And yet, like, that infinite range is divisible into non-arbitrary categories, right? So I know the Greeks have lots of different definitions of love, and those are, it starts to get outside the scope of the conversation to actually define it, to define each one of those things. But the point is, like, we can make divisions in infinite categories, and they're meaningful distinctions. And so the point is, love of one's country and love of one's family are comparable infinities. Like there's no limit to how much you can love your country, and there's no limit to how much you can love your spouse. But we can say that one of those is of higher value than the other. And that's going to be a temperamental thing, right? Different people are going to come down on different sides of that fence. And I mean, this gets to be a little too complicated for me to unpack perfectly, but like people have different values. And one of the things that we're seeing is that the love of the tribe and the love of the country and the patriotic sense in people is giving way to the love of individuals. And it's like, that's one of the triumphs of Western civilization, as far as I'm concerned.
Cool. And Virginia Woolf says, actually, why should women love their country? Because, and she's speaking about England, because of the disenfranchisement and so forth. So people have different experiences of country. And so yes, good. That what you're saying there is material for, I think, 2 shows. But in any case, in Martha's example, this is the thing that's trumping her, and I think that it's going to come round to Frederick. So we began this show with the very last sentence of chapter 6, which again is, what a foolish world, still in leading strings, cruel, unthinking. This was the result of my historical studies. So this is going to be the last section that we discuss. This is we're coming to an end. And I think it was Riley, I can't remember, one of you brought up the reasons of state, okay, that in the text, the history of its causes is the subheading. So Martha is going to, she tries to understand the history of the conflict. Like, why is this even a looming possibility? And so she turns to history again, and she turns specifically to what she calls the reasons of state, which is like the actual justification of the war. And so she reads about some treaties and about some borders shifting and so forth. And it's after that that she says this sentence that we began with, which is actually the last sentence. What a foolish world, that sentence. But I'm going to read these pages, this section. That's at the very end of the text. And it's really on pages 136 to 140 that she's going through, like, it's 4 pages of such and such signed this treaty. And then, the prince was declared this, but then this agreement was had, and then that was broken. And she's going through 4 pages of state activity through treaties and so forth. And so here's a little summary. It is said that the London Protocol had to be respected. Why? Are these protocols about things which concern us absolutely nothing so exceedingly to be respected that we must defend them at the price of the blood of our own sons? If so, there must lie in the background some mysterious reason of state, for it must be firmly held as a dogma that what the gentlemen round the green table of diplomacy may decide is the highest wisdom, and has for its aim the greatest possible advance of the power of one's country. The London Protocol of 8th May 1852 had to be made intact, but the fundamental law of Copenhagen of 13th January 1863 had to be abolished, and that within 24 hours. On that hung Austria's honor and welfare. The dogma was a little hard to believe, but in political matters, almost more willingly than in religious, the masses allow themselves to be led by the principle of the quia absurdum. They have renounced beforehand the attempt to reason and understand. So that's the end of that passage. But I just found this striking because this, as we said at the beginning of the show, we're as of today, right, there's conflict going on, and not just in Ukraine, but for various reasons, that particular conflict is really being hammered home by our media in the United States. And, you know, why is Putin doing this? And I've seen a number of different quote explanations, from he's preventing genocide, right, to the preventing the expansion of NATO. He's also, goes back to medieval history and Prince Vladimir and this unity between Ukraine and Russia. And so when I was reading this section, I was just reminded of that. And the point that she's making here is, well, so what that these treaties X, Y, and Z, and like who is to say that we must defend them at the price of the blood of our own sons? Why is respecting a treaty or protecting a border, why does that outweigh the life of our sons? And so she's asking that here, and that's how she concludes this chapter. Again, what a foolish world, still in leading strings, cruel, unthinking. And so she just doesn't, it doesn't compute, right, that like why you would make this calculus, and she uses that phrase in other works, that this like hierarchy of goods makes no sense to her, that the highest value is the life and limb of the people that we have our bonds to, and those should be protected. I know, Randy, you're going to say exactly, and that goes back to the passage before, that they should be protected, is why we fight to defend them, right? So I'll stop. There's more I could say, but I will see if either of you want to chime in about this last section about reasons of state. Randy, go ahead.
So there's 100 ways to take this, but I'll make the one that's connected to some of the things that I've learned directly from Bertha von Suttner. And the one that comes first, as far as I can tell at the moment, is it's not so much of a reason as it is like a justification. We could see how this would make sense. It is essentially the state making these value judgments is radically discounting both the lives of individuals and the labor of women. Essentially, like 18 years of labor. I know this is a quote from somewhere else, but it's like 18 years of labor going to make a life is like thrown away, and willingly thrown away. Like that's essentially that's the piece that's getting ignored. And so in the world today, we have conversations about things that are not factored into the cost. What was it? Something, it's like externalities or something. Unforeseen costs.
Yes,
There's
externalities.
There's a term for that. And at this point, like it seems like the negotiating parties at the state's diplomatic tables are failing to take into consideration the value of both human life and women's labor. And as far as I can tell, that's changed in the world we live in. The value of the individual is increasing, and the value of women's labor is increasing. And so we start to have a hard time coming to the same conclusions that they came to in the time this was written.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks for that. Yeah, it's Jane Addams, who she's one of like several people make that point about the work of women, the art of women in child rearing, and how much effort it takes to make it a human being. And it was one of the complaints, most clearly by the United States movement, the suffragists, because, World War I is happening. And ostensibly, Woodrow Wilson's narrative was for democracy. And the women are like, dude, democracy doesn't exist here because we have no political voice. And this is taxation without representation, and you're taking our sons, right? How can you say it's a democracy when you take our sons and you deny us a voice in the government? And for this, they were imprisoned. And anyway, so yeah, right. The state is not including all of the factors, and if they are, they're severely discounting them, right? Like it's like worth a penny or something like this. Riley, did you want to chime in or?
Yes, I had a couple things
Cool.
to throw in about the reasons of state. So there's like a really short passage here that I just wanted to share. I know that my pages are different than yours, so I'm not sure where it is in the text that is on our show resources page, but in my version, it's on page 147. And so they're having this conversation about war at a dinner table, and Martha asks a minister who's basically a diplomat if there's like any way that the diplomatists can like prevent the conflict from breaking out into war. And he responds, "Do you think then, Baroness, that it is our office to maintain perpetual peace? That would, to be sure, be a grand mission, only not practicable. We exist only to watch over the interests of our respective states and dynasties, to work against anything that may threaten the diminution of their power, and strive to conquer for them every supremacy possible, jealously to guard the honor of the country, to avenge any insult cast on it." And Martha interrupts, saying, in short, to act on the principle of war, to do to the enemy, i.e. every other state, all the harm possible, and if a dispute begins, to persist as long as possible in asserting that you are in the right, even if you see you are in the wrong. And the minister replies, "To be sure." And so then a bit later, she concludes that like any reason, quote unquote, reasons of state given to justify hostilities are, she says, nothing but phrases and pretexts.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And that is, that line of argument that the state can do anything to protect its interests is alive and well. And it's the argument that the United States has given in, international courts of law to defend their right to use nuclear weapons. We've talked about it on this show, that you can't say that these weapons are per se inherently illegal, because there is no such thing. That is, there could be a situation where the interest is so great that it justifies the horror. I'm paraphrasing, but they basically argue that. And it's been one of my complaints, the coverage of this war, where I know that the media is using these phrases like war criminal and genocide and so forth. But, the horrible thing is collateral damage is legal. It's when you actually target civilians that you have a, quote, war crime. You can't target a non-combatant, but you can kill a bunch of them if the objective is compelling enough. That's where we are. And I have a problem with that. So women and children, they can be killed as long as you're not, quote, targeting them. And then you have to prove that there is a targeting going on. So I know that there's a trial today where an individual soldier did plead guilty to killing a non-combatant. And that's a different thing than saying that, the generals are issuing, targeting orders on schools. And the United States, God bless them, I do love the United States. They issued orders during the Korean War to shoot on civilians because the North Koreans were blending with them. And so therefore just like kill the, like if you see refugees, kill them. That go back to our shows on the Korean War to brush up on that. So yeah, like what that passage that you read, Riley, is getting at where we are today, and it's why we do this show, to educate ourselves and to transmit some of these things, which are really they're not talked about as much as they should. I also just wanted to, and this will be the time when we're closing down the discussion, and if we have anything finally to say, like now's the time to say it, and I will begin, and then I'll just pass it to you, Randy, and then Riley, you'll have the last word. But with this passage and this very first sentence that we began with, which for the 5th time, what a foolish world, still in leading strings, cruel, unthinking. This was the result of my historical studies. I wanted to contrast that, and going back to our prior installments of the show, where we discussed the reading that Martha does of history in a different way, not understanding the reasons of state, but the reading of Thomas Buckle's History of Civilization. So we talked about this on the very first show, but when she comes away from reading that, right, which is different from the reasons of state, twice, actually she reads it 3 times in this book, but it's after the second read that she feels elevated by the view of history that she's just learned. And it's this grand sweeping narrative about, it's interpreting history with an evolutionary lens, and it's an upward progressive movement of the species. And she walks away from that reading inspired, whereas when she goes into the reading of the reasons of state and that kind of history, because it's called the history of its causes, right? The history of the Schleswig-Holstein War and the reasons of state, she's, not elevated, and, what a foolish world, and oh, woe is me. So that ends chapter 6. So I think that will set us up for our next installment, which I imagine will be chapters 7 and 8. And so, Randy, final thoughts?
Yeah, so I guess I'm interested in doing kind of a stepping back and evaluating where we are kind of statement. We're here on Peace Day, which was a day intended to remind us of one of the pivotal pockets in human civilization, where the moral attitude towards war changed in a fundamental way. And so we're seeing the seeds of it in this book and in this chapter. And we're seeing the characters wrestling psychologically with this large shift in attitude toward one of the most important social and cultural events. One of the things that's always been important and changed the world more than most things, we'll put it that way, and that's war. War's clearly been something that shaped civilization. And so we are exploring and investigating how that has shifted or begun to shift, and how our values and how our ideals are beginning to change in relation to that enormous human activity of war. and the fact that our world today has had, at least in the story presented to the Western media and the Western world, a essentially universal repugnance, universal distaste, disgust towards a war of aggression, or whatever we're going to label Russia's activities in the Ukraine as. It seems to indicate to me the staggering truth in these pages of this book as foreshadowing, as a sign of things to come. We are in that time where the things in this book have taken hold in some meaningful way. It's obviously part of a larger grand scheme, some lot more work to be done in order to bring different ideals into the world and into culture and into the human consciousness. But if we take this book and compare it to where we are today, roughly, 130, 140 years later, 130, we can see a seismic shift for sure. There's definitely a different cultural attitude. And so I'm interested to see where it goes from here.
And I'll just share my last thought too. And Randy, like you were saying, like we've seen this huge shift in, just in general, our perspective on war. There's most people feel a repugnance towards wars of aggression, like you said. And something that Martha expresses while she's reading her history of the conflict, she kind of thinks to herself, like, isn't it so lucky that we live in a time where these treaties and stuff are written down with the date, so you can see like when this happened and kind of trace it. And this connects to your thought, Randy, is like, isn't it, aren't we so lucky that we have this book and we can look down like the year that she wrote it and see all of Bertha's thoughts about this, like the kind of experience going through it and the general cultural ideas around her, and then compare that with now and see how much has changed and where we are. And I don't know, it just feels lucky to have those sorts of things record. Not even lucky, just it's good to have those sorts of things recorded. And I think that also connects to something else that Bertha gets at with this book, is that, Martha has all these journals she's writing, and the book that we have in our hands, when we're reading, is supposed to be kind of, Martha has written her autobiography based on journals she kept. And so it's kind of like keeping that in mind. It's like, keeping the history, keeping her journal is part of keeping history, and it's just as important as having those treaties. So I guess where I'm trying to get with all of this is that, what we're doing now here, it's Peace Day 2022, it's May 18th, and she's writing in the late 1870s, right? Yeah, so I just am excited that we're doing this, that we're a part of it, and we can now, like, we've plotted another point to carry our red thread through. And so we will continue doing this soon, our next installment, with chapters 7 and 8.
Awesome. Thank you, Riley, and thank you, everyone. Happy Peace Day 2022. You've been listening to Virtues of Peace. Check out our show resources page at virtuesofpeace.com, and we will be back in a couple of weeks with the next installment. This will be the fourth installment of our Lay Down Your Arms mini-series. Good night.